Well, welcome. It is good to be with you all this morning as we join together to discuss youth and young adult faith formation. And we're going to talk about specifically discovering God at work in the lives of those that we journey with. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Tanya Campen, and I am the Director of Intergenerational Discipleship here at the Rio, Texas Conference Office. And I am joining you this morning from San Antonio and my office. So it is good to be here and to be around this digital table with you. Part of my job here at the conference office is to join with you in ministry with persons of all ages. And as I've listened over the last 2 years to you all and others, from across our conference, one of the things persons have stated would be really helpful are some resources that help us understand people that we are in ministry with a little bit better. And so we created the Growing Together series, and we've started with webinars, and I'm excited that over the next few years this ministry Growing Together UMC will be developing. We'll be adding more resources, we'll be adding more tools, so stay tuned for that. But I'm excited that this year we have kicked off the webinar. Today we are going to talk specifically about youth and young adults, and we're going to really be looking at the developmental stages and ages really of about 12, 13 on up to 26. So that's kind of when I say youth and young adults, we're looking at what's going on with our 12, 13-year-olds through 26. So those entering adolescence, moving through adolescence towards that monumentous moment of around 26, when we know that the brain it becomes fully developed around 25, 26. So that's what kind of gives us that age bracket. We know that's still a really big, broad bracket, but just wanted to give you kind of clarity around what we're going to be talking about today. So our work, we're going to look at these two questions. We're going to look at how do youth and young adults grow in their faith, and we're going to talk about them today using the understanding, the description of them as identity creators. So we're going to talk about what does it mean to be moving through adolescence all the way up to full brain development as they ask the question, who am I? That identity, that big identity question. So we're going to talk about that today. And then the second question we're going to ask is, how can we as leaders in ministry join these people on their journey? And we're going to talk about our role as mentors, teachers, listeners, learners, and guides. I invite you to write down, to get a piece of paper if you have it available. And on that piece of paper, I invite you just to write straight down on your piece of paper the numbers 1 through 10. So just a vertical line of the numbers 1 through 10. All right? So when I say go, you're going to have 30 seconds just to write the first 10 things down on your piece of paper when I give you the topic. So here's your topic. When I say youth and young adult, what do you think? What words come to mind? 30 seconds and go. Top 10 things that come to mind when I say youth or young adults. And you can write that down. Take about 15 more seconds. And stop. So hopefully you have a really great list. And now I invite you to share some of the things that came to mind in the chat box. Energy, yes. Oftentimes there's a lot of energy in this age. Thanks, Laura. Food, fun, changes, self-identification, and friends. Boredom. Yeah, that's an interesting one to talk about for sure. Others. Diverse, bold, creative, passionate, outspoken. I'm loving all these positive words. Middle school, high school, awkward. Yes. College age, funny. Yeah, oftentimes we find those of this age can have a really good sense of humor. Those are really great words to help us start getting our brains around really kind of who we are talking about. And so now what I want to invite you to do is just on that same piece of paper at the bottom, maybe writing the names of youth and young adults you're in ministry with, or maybe if you're ministry with a specific group of youth and young adults, you might write the name of that group. But I invite you just to put those you're in ministry with before you. It's a reminder that as we talk about development and what might be happening in a person's brain and body, and as we talk about teaching methods, it's a reminder that every person is unique and every person is different. So today, as we talk about, general statements about this really big age group, I invite you to have the names and maybe the faces of those you're in ministry with before you, to remember that each of those persons are their own individual amazing creation of God. And so part of our work is actually just to get to know the individuals. But hopefully talking about the bigger picture today will be helpful as well. So as we jump into it, just a very short, we don't have a lot of time for human development today, but a short introduction to human development. Whenever I think about youth and young adults, I often think of this quote from Dr. Seuss. "Today you are you, that is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you." So I'll let you just kind of ponder that for a minute as we move into talking about youth and young adults. For those of you who were with me or have viewed the webinar we did on children and faith formation, you'll know that whenever I talk about the work that children are doing in development, that what they're really doing is creating memories and experiences. They're engaging with the world around them and they're learning from all those experiences. And so I describe them as meaning makers. And I say what they're doing is they're collecting all of their Legos, all of their blocks, all of their memories that at some point is going to help that shape and form who they are. It's all of this information they've gathered from the world around them. And so when we move into talking about youth and young adults and we start talking, describing them as identity creators, what I like to think about is now at around age 12, 13, they've made all of these connections in their brain as they've engaged with their environment. They've gathered all of these Legos, all of these experiences. They've made all of this meaning out of the world around them. And so what I like to think about happens when they enter into 12, 13, start moving into puberty and adolescence, and those hormones start going, that really and truly what their work now, they're moving into taking all of those building blocks, all of those Legos, and going, what do I do with all of these in a way that makes sense to me and helps me understand who and whose I am. And so thus the picture of the Legos everywhere is kind of a reminder that they're doing the hard and holy work of reflecting on all of that meaning that they've made and asking, what of this do I want to hold on to? What of this do I want to let go of? What of this truly speaks to who I think I am? So doing this hard and holy work of building their identity. It's important to remember that in this age group, their brains are still growing. One of my favorite things to say is the teen brain is under construction.
The part of the brain that the teenager is really working on developing is the prefrontal cortex, which is located in the cerebral cortex, or the front part of the frontal lobe of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for planning complex cognitive behavior, personality expression, decision making, and moderating social behavior. And so when we say the teenage brain is developing this part of the brain, we then know that they're developing these skills and these traits. What they're really working on is developing their executive function as it relates to differentiating among conflicting thoughts, determining good and bad, better and best, same and different, and being able to identify future consequences of current activity.
Therefore, they're really still driven by their emotional part of their brain. They're very impulsive as they work to develop the parts of their brain that will give them the ability to make rational, logical decisions. It's not that they're not capable of doing that. It's just that they're still doing the work of developing those skills. And that's helpful for us to know as we join in ministry with youth and young adults, to give them opportunities to practice. But knowing that the brain is still developing, knowing that they're still doing the hard and holy work of developing those logical and rational skills, and that their tendency and what they have readily available to them is their emotional response, gives us information as we ask God, how are you calling us to be in ministry with youth and young adults? And so, in the midst of all of this, as their brains developing, their bodies are growing, they're experience potentially more responsibility out in the world, especially as they move from high school into college age, or those early 20s, and then move into, move out of their parents' homes, move into the workforce, and start asking the question of, well, now that I'm in this crazy big adult world, how am I going to choose to show up in this world? Who am I? What do I have to offer? So lots of really big questions going on in this age group. And some of the key questions that they're asking are these. Who am I? Which is, again, a question of identity. Where do I fit in? Which is a question of belonging. What difference can I make? Which is a question of purpose. And as we reflect on these questions, I'm curious to know, as you think about these, how do you see these questions impacting ministry? As you consider, gosh, knowing that they're asking these questions, where can we create space to ask these questions? So I'm curious to know, as you think about this, are you already going, oh, wow, I see this impacting ministry in this way? Yes, as Bernard just said, conveying adventure of asking good questions. Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, I want everybody to hold on to that call to ask really good questions is really going to be important as we do this work. So let's talk a little bit about what youth and young adults need for the journey. As their brains are developing, their bodies are developing, they're moving through adolescence, into high school, potentially into college, or in those early 20 years and into the workforce. We know that there's lots going on in this part of their journey. And so let's talk about really what they need. First, actually, believe it or not, what they really need is sleep. I always joke when I'm talking to youth and young adults about this and about their brains and what's going on in their body. And I always say, scientists and doctors actually tell us in this time of your life, you really need around 10 to 12 hours of sleep a day. And I'm just going to let that sit with you and see what responses I get in the chat box about that. Because we know that oftentimes the opposite is true for this age group, that they're not getting near enough sleep, much less what seems like a lot to us, the 10 to 12, right? So their brains are doing so much work of they're still taking in information, they're still making meaning, but they're also wrestling with all of this information. Their brains are physically, what happens in brain development is when you make a connection, there's chemicals that go across the brain, synapses are formed and learnings are made. And then what happens in adolescence is the brain starts going, okay, what of this do I need? What of this do I want to get rid of? And it starts doing the work that's called pruning. And I think it's fascinating because scripture has something to say about that, right? When Jesus talks about pruning the vine, our brains actually do that work. And so not only are our youth and young adolescents taking in information and doing that hard work, they're also doing the hard work of what can I keep? What do I get rid of? Their brains are growing, their bodies are growing. I mean, just thinking about that exhausts me. And so you can see why they need a lot of sleep. And so one of the things we can do in ministry, especially when we're planning events and camps and retreats and overnight activities, is looking at our schedule and saying, are they getting downtime? Are they getting the sleep that they need? So it's a good question to ask. It's a good thing to know. It's a good thing to keep in mind. And it's a good thing to teach parents and families and youth and young adults themselves to say, are you sleeping? Are you sleeping enough? So that's the first tool that we have readily available to us. So the second tool that we have for engaging with youth and young adult ministry is what I like to call the dreams or the dreaming process. And like Bernard said, asking good questions. As youth and young adults do the hard and holy work of asking, who am I? Asking those identity questions, those belonging questions. Where do I fit in? Asking those purpose questions. What difference can I make? It's important to invite them into a space where they can just dream and say, I wonder what this might look like. The Reverend Dr. David White, who is professor of Christian education at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, wrote a whole book on the importance of dreaming connected with youth ministry, and I recommend it to you. But in this book, he says, dreaming constitutes the free space for joyful creation. And that dreaming is also to be authentic. To author one's own life is to dream the alternatives and make deliberate choices. And I think just in this, there is a call to holy work with our youth and young adults and asking, where do we create space for this? So I'd be curious to hear from you as you think about this. Where in your ministries are you already doing this work, or where do you see potential for, as you journey with youth and young adults, inviting them into this dreaming process? And so I'll see kind of what you have to share. But what does this look like in your ministry now, or where do you see space for maybe this to be added into your ministry with youth and young adults? In my experience, this dreaming comes in times of reflection. It also comes when there are adults present as mentors, as guides, conversation partners who can come alongside and invite and encourage youth and young adults to ask those questions and say, I wonder what, God's calling you to do. I wonder what gifts you have. I wonder what this might look like. And then we also know when there's disappointment in life and life doesn't go as planned. For example, the soccer player who's played soccer his or her entire life, and they already have a full scholarship to college, and they're going to be, full ride to college soccer player. And then at 17 or 18, their junior or senior year of high school, they tear their ACL, right? Or something else happens, and immediately they see a dream that comes to an end. And there is an opportunity for us, those of us who are journeying with them, to grieve that dream, right? For many, that may be the first time that they've really had that sense of loss. And so to have adults present who can grieve that dream with them, and then when they're ready, right, honoring the grief process, when they're ready, inviting them to dream about other possibilities. And so dreaming involves being realistic, but it also means creating a space where we create hope and help them find their purpose. Yes, Miguel, thank you. Dreaming is an opportunity. An opportunity for dreaming is when it comes to the application of the lesson. Instead of giving them a specific application, inviting them, creating open space for them to have conversation, for them to come up with their answers. One of my favorite videos about open-endedness in terms of lessons comes from a photographer for the National Geographic. But he did this whole documentary on finding the right answer. And he goes through this explanation that even as a photographer, he's constantly shifting his focus, he's constantly changing lenses, he's constantly changing spaces. And in doing that, it's not that he's looking for that one right picture, but he's looking for the multitude of all the right answers, all the possibilities. And so when we're engaging in conversation, I think you're right, Miguel, when we're engaging in conversation, when we're leading lessons, when we're working with youth and young adults, making sure there's that space for them to discern, what is one right answer for me in this moment today? And so again, whenever you're planning small groups or lessons or even sermon series or overnight activities, looking and seeing, where do we create space for dreaming, for wondering, for asking those big questions. So thank you for that. The other tool that we have available to us is this opportunity to invite youth and young adults to use their brains and to think, to really practice critical thinking. Oftentimes, kind of like what Miguel was describing, and we talked about if you were here for the children and faith formation, oftentimes as ministry leaders, we see our job as just giving information, right? They're going to open up their heads and we're going to fill it with all the information we need. And what's really important, especially at this age, is that instead of just giving information, we present information in a way that they are then invited to, I always use my Play-Doh with this imagery, but that they're invited just to hold that information and kind of work with it and wrestle with it and say, what do I think about this? And I don't know, what would, where are some good examples of people, what would they do? And kind of really wrestling with that. As youth and young adults develop that part of their brain for logical and critical thinking, their immediate answer is going to come from their emotion and their impulse, but to invite them to think deeper. So perhaps it's providing, scenarios and inviting them to critically think about how they would respond. Or if and when they come to you with a question, giving it back to them and say, I don't know, what do you think? I think, again, this is when mentors and persons who come, guides and shepherds, persons who come alongside the youth and young adults are so helpful, because they can model what deep thinking really looks like, and then they can invite the youth and young adults they're in ministry with to join them in that hard work and that conversation. So again, in ministry, asking, where can we provide space for youth and young adults really to practice as they're developing these skills, to practice using those skills for deep critical thinking is really a great tool and opportunity. And then finally, the tool that we have available to us is the tool, of course, of relationships. As youth and young adults do the hard work of discerning, their identity, their place of belonging, their purpose, the best place to do this is in conversation with others, so with their peers, but also in conversation with persons in different places on the journey. So adult mentors who can speak to, the challenges they've had and how they've overcome them, the dreams they've had, the dreams that have been fulfilled, and the dreams that they've had to grieve, the losses they've experienced. And so we know it's a good reminder of how people learn is by having something modeled and then being invited to practice it. This works for all ages. So we talked about this when we talked about children, but especially for youth and young adults, for there to be a community of people around working with youth and young adults who can model, what does it look like to ask these questions? What does it look like to discern, the answers to these questions, knowing that there might be an answer for today and there might be another answer for tomorrow, and helping youth and young adults just continue to do that work of asking those questions of who am I? Where do I fit in? And what am I called to do? How can I make a difference in this world? Yes, thank you, Bernard. I love this, creative imagination of positive outcomes rather than destructive negativity of dark fears. That's really, really well said, Bernard. Thank you. But this idea of creating space where persons come alongside youth and young adults and invite them into this imaginative, creative space where they can see all the positive outcomes, all the positive possibilities, all the positive right answers, if you will, instead of, going, well, you could never do that, and you could never do that, and oh, if you do that, you might not make enough money, and, all those dark negativity and dark fears. We want to be realistic, but we want to be realistic in a way that's positive and that open space instead of what I say, shutting it down. So thank you for that, Bernard. That's really great wisdom. And so then the final tool that we have available to us are faith formation practices. Asking, what are our spiritual disciplines? What are our spiritual tools that we have available to help youth and young adults with this work? So that I always like to think about along our faith journey, no matter our age, that we're carrying this toolbox of tools to use on this journey. And so part of our job as ministry leaders is to get, to present a tool to those we're in ministry with, to model how it's used, to invite persons to practice it, and to say, does this work for you? So for example, last week I was with a group of Christian educators, and they were invited to practice praying in color. And so praying in color is a spiritual practice that can be used to allow visual and kinesthetic learners an opportunity to process and reflect as they're talking to God. And so all the participants were invited to do that work. And again, it's an opportunity to say, I don't know if this will work for you, but I invite you, I'm going to model it for you, that I'm going to invite you to practice it. And then we're going to reflect on, how did that feel? Were you able to connect? How did that help you connect to God? What were the challenges in doing this work? So that they get a chance not only just to go, okay, today we're going to journal, everybody journal. Okay, now we're done journaling. But instead, there's somebody who shares the benefits of journaling and the different processes for journaling, then invites them to practice it, and then gives them a chance to reflect on it. We know anytime we pick up a new tool, the other day I was helping with a Joshua build, and I guess I hadn't picked up a hammer in a really long time, and I felt like it was just really wonky in my hand, and I was having a really hard time getting it to do what I needed it to do. And that's true with any tool, especially if we've never used it before. Think about getting on the bike for the first time. And so we want to invite them to pick up these tools, to play with them, to try working with them, knowing the first couple times are going to be wonky. So that's important to remember too. So I'm curious, as we think about that, what are some tools that you see, some spiritual practices that you think would be helpful for working with youth and young adults? So I invite you to share in the chat box, some tools that you see as being helpful that maybe you might model, invite youth and young adults to practice. We'll give you a few seconds to think about that and then to share in the chat box. Music, yes, listening and creating, especially now with all the access we have to music and streaming, inviting them to find ways within that and to see how it spurs their creative energy. Thank you, Laura. Others? Give you a few more seconds. Of course, in terms of prayer, there's lots of different ways to practice prayer. Maybe we model and invite them to participate in a body prayer that gets their whole body moving. Maybe we invite them to practice and participate in prayerful yoga that gives them another way to connect. Other tools that you might think of. There's lots of disciplines in terms of, for our kinesthetic learners, walking the labyrinth, they're doing the finger labyrinth, teaching persons how to journal, teaching persons, Lectio Divina, how do you read one verse of scripture or one piece of scripture and then reflect on it, and then go back to that same scripture and then reflect on it again. This idea of really soaking in the scriptures can be really helpful for this age group as well. There are so many tools out there. I know I'm missing so many of them. The other, opportunity tools, spiritual practice of service, of getting out there actually and doing God's holy work, and then having an opportunity to come back and to reflect on that and to say, how did that feel? How did we experience God in that? Those kinds of activities, ministries are really helpful and important as well. So lots of great faith formation practices, but I think overall the biggest piece with this is just to make sure that you're modeling and inviting them to practice in lots of different possibilities, because not every person is going to pick up the same faith formation practice. And they may pick up one faith formation practice today and choose a whole different one tomorrow or next year or in 5 years. And so providing ways to make sure that they're getting an opportunity to see all the different ways to practice the faith that are available. So now let's talk a little bit about the steps that we can take and the intentionality we can have in ministry with youth and young adults that can help us with this work. First and foremost, we want to build respect. We start with respect in our ministry as ministry leaders, as guides, as teachers. We come into this work, and the first building block, if you will, for this work is developing respect. And that starts with paying attention, getting to know the persons that you are in ministry with. Take them seriously. You know, sometimes youth and young adults share their stories, and I've seen adults just kind of giggle and move on. And really and truly, what they really need is somebody to take them seriously, somebody to deeply listen to them. Something to try as you're building respect, getting to know one another, is youth and adult interviews. So if you're a young adult and older adult or interviews, but where you are creating a ministry opportunity where you have youth and young adults and those who are going to journey with them, and having them interview one another to get to know one another. A good model of this that churches have found helpful, that they've shared with me has been helpful, is this model of what some refer to as speed dating or speed interviewing, where you set people up around the room and they have about 3 to 5 minutes to talk to the person, and then a bell rings and they switch and they go talk to another person. But being really intentional on building these relationships. The next building block for this work is the call to listen. It's really important that we create safe space. Again, we start with respect. We take them seriously. We say we do care about you. We want to get to know you. And then we create space to listen. And in creating a safe space to listen, it's also creating a safe space to explore questions. And so when you're looking at curriculum, you want to look for curriculum that allows for exploration and questions. You want to set up a flexible space that allows for conversation. And so this might mean at the beginning of your time together, you create a group covenant where you commit to how you're going to work and show up together so that persons feel safe in a way that they can be vulnerable and they can share and not be afraid that somebody is going to be that negative person, or somebody's not going to take them seriously, but instead to do the holy work of creating that safe space. And so that means recruiting intergenerational leaders who will encourage, guide, and will encourage and guide that exploration. So you want to find leaders who are good at asking those really big questions and are really good at moderating the space and facilitating that conversation, instead of the leaders who want just to provide the right answer over the one answer over and over and over again. So it's also then important in listening to ask open-ended questions, to wonder, and then to remember. This is the hard part. And so, leaders might be encouraged when they leave to do their own journaling, to write down who they met, what they heard, so that the next time you go back, you can remember the young person's name, you can remember what they're excited about, you can maybe even remember what they're dreaming about, or the challenges that they've had, or the losses they've experienced. So that way you can continue that relationship, but it also affirms to that young person that you really were listening. You remembered, you really were listening, you really do care. And then, of course, to respond appropriately in a way that you say, I hear what you're saying. I'm sorry you feel that way, or I'm excited to see where this journey takes you. But to give that affirmation, that response that says, I really am listening and I really do care. And so something to try is creating space for holy conversations, where again, you might do that group covenant where you set up the space in terms of, this is how we're going to show up. We're going to take turns. We're going to listen to one another. We're going to treat each other with respect, whatever your group covenant roles are and expectations are. And then to try having holy conversation just by asking one wondering question. and see where it goes, knowing, again, this is a spiritual tool that when you pick it up, it's going to be wonky. And if persons have never done this before, if you're in a space that is new, people may not immediately trust that the space is safe. And so you have to continue to do this work to practice it so that persons can grow to trust it. A couple of great resources for this work, and I'm going to put in, because I don't have the direct website written down, and I'm going to see if I don't know if I can spell it correctly. A great resource for having holy conversations is the Kaleidoscope Project. The Kaleidoscope Project has created a really great tool for having conversation in a way that everybody gets to share and everybody is listening, and it's formatted and moderated in a way that's safe. So the Kaleidoscope Project, and I will make sure to put that on the Growing Together website as a resource so that you have that. But Kaleidoscope Project is really good for creating holy conversations. Another one just is, I have this box of big questions that I use for all age groups. And so just opening up with one question, say, we're going to practice doing this. And it might be when you start creating that holy space in order to practice it and practice it well, you might start with kind of an easier, lighter question. What is your favorite color and why? And so you practice having holy conversation around that lighter question. You'd be surprised how deep that can go really quickly too with our youth and young adults. But starting with what can be a lighter question is often helpful to practice it and to get through that wonkiness of doing something new and creating a new safe space. So the next building block for this work is, of course, to build trust. So this happens when you start with respect, you do a lot of deep listening, and then you move into building that trust by showing up, right? When you show up, connecting, asking questions, having conversation, engaging in the activities. Oftentimes I go to youth and young adult events and there's so much activity going on in the middle of the room by the young people, but then if you look around the room, it's like the fishbowl effect. You have a bunch of other people kind of around the room watching what's going on. And so I always say, connect, show up, connect, participate, be present. Be reliable. If you say you're going to do something, make sure that you do it. And if you're unable to follow through, let them know why. Be authentic. Be who you are. Be the you, going back to Dr. Seuss, be the you that God called you to be. Be responsible. Remember that your role in this is to be the adult who's modeling this work. So what you model, as youth and young adults are doing this hard work of discerning who they are and their brains are developing and they're developing those critical thinking skills, it's really important that the adults in their lives show up well and show up as the responsible adult, not, the buddy or the friend. I mean, you can be silly and you can be goofy and you can have fun, but they need reliable and responsible adults in their lives to model for them different ways of showing up in the world. And so a fun way to do this and to connect and to build relationships is, of course, engaging in trust games. And there's lots of those available to you for sure. And youth and young adults really like participating in something active where they can connect with one another and build that trust with one another. Then after building that trust, the opportunity arises, and the next building block is the opportunity to learn. So those you were in ministry with, those youth and young adults, get to know their interests, get to know their gifts, get to know their dreams. And so this is a really great place to wonder, especially like when you're building one-on-one mentors and having conversations in small groups. Say, I wonder what your gifts are. I wonder what you dream about. Because that'll be helpful later on as continue our ministry with youth and young adults. When they hit a bump in the road or when they feel challenged, say that young person who tears their ACL is like, what am I going to do? Soccer was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. You can say to them, you know what, you have shown me that you have these other gifts. You're really good at math. You're really good at helping other people. You're really good at teaching, right? So when you see their gifts, you can start to open up other doors and possibilities. But that can only happen if you've spent the time to get to know them and to learn who they are. And then finally, the last building block for this work is taking time and being intentional in your time to bless those that you're in ministry with. And this can look different depending on your context and depending on the individuals you're in ministry with. But this is an opportunity to say, God loves you. God is with you. Go knowing you are loved. So at the end of time together, taking the opportunity to connect, to really see the person you're in ministry with. You know, when I do this with children, I do it the same with youth and young people. I ask them if they want a blessing, and do they want it on their forehead or on their hand? And so, you know, you can make the sign of a cross. So you say, God loves you, God's with you, go knowing you are loved. The other thing you can do that works really well with youth and young adults is giving them something tangible. So you see the big bucket picture of rocks that I have that they're all marked on. And so you can write a blessing or a word on a rock, or you don't even have to write anything at all on the rock, but as you pray over it and then you hand it to the youth or young adult, you can say, you know, may this be a reminder that God is with you wherever you go. But doing something to connect with each person and to offer them a blessing whenever you see them is another great way to really establish that strong relationship. So again, those building blocks: respect, listen, trust, learn, and bless. Those are great building blocks for ministry with youth and young adults for sure. And at the end of the day, to remember that your role is to create a safe space, to be in relationship, to model the faith, to practice the faith, and to wonder with those you're in ministry with. I'm going to put up some of my favorite resources for youth and young adult ministry. And know that you can go to riotexas.org/IG resources for more resources. And then, of course, I will put the Kaleidoscope model on the Growing Together website as well. So you'll have a link to that. Grateful that all of you were here. I really appreciate you coming and joining the conversation. I hope this was helpful as you start thinking about your ministry with youth and young adults, and think about, you know, what am I doing really well? What can we add? You know, how can we do some training with our leaders who work with youth and young adults so that they can see the importance of all of this for sure? And then once you have this really strong foundation, you know, taking all the ministries and all the fun games and all the opportunities and asking, you know, how do we take this, do this inside the walls, but outside of the walls as well? You know, how do we create small groups, whether that's in a coffee shop, whether that's out, you know, on a hiking excursion, but providing, you know, doing this whole hard and holy work no matter what the activity is. Because once you build this foundation, you know, the activities can change and flow as you do the hard and holy work of building these relationships and supporting the youth and young adults as they grow and as they develop and as they grow and as they discern how they're going to show up in the world today, tomorrow, and in the future. Thanks again for being here. I am grateful to each of you in your ministry, and I just pray God's blessings upon all the work you're doing with youth and young adults. God be with you.